How's it going, YouTube? Coming to today with another video, and today, guys, what I'm bringing you is going to be where to hand trap, and I'm very excited to bring you this video because there's a lot to talk about this format, a lot of different decks out there. So before we cover that, if you want to go check out my sponsors over on Imperium Duelist, Dragon Shield, Gem, or Sleeve Chief, definitely go ahead and do so, all down below in the description. Also, if you haven't already went over to Imperium Duelist and checked out my playmat, definitely go ahead and check that out. And then last but not least, thank you so much, Nathan, for making my new logo for where to hand trap. I really do appreciate it. I'll leave their link down in the description below, and without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into our first topic. The first thing I want to talk about today is going to be Vanquish Soul. Now, the one hand trap I didn't include on this is going to be Bell. Bell is like very okay against this matchup. You can Bell the Link One's effect to add back, or you can Bell Continue, which is also pretty okay, but I just don't really think that it's as impactful enough at that point. I'd rather go ahead and bring up the most important interactions here. So like Ashing Rosin is going to be one of the best things that you can do. You could imperm Rosin, but like the odds that they open Caesar or Borgo are pretty high, so it'd be wasting a card, and I really wouldn't want to see you do that. So just like Ash the Rosin is fine. You can Crow the target of Continue, or like Crow the effect of Rock to add back like a Rosin, which is really good because then you get the resource loop out of the way, and then your opponent doesn't have the pop that they just added back, and they don't have the ability to keep searching, so definitely really important. And then before you hit main phase, you can also imperm the Rock, so that's also really solid too, just to shut off any free summons from the hand for more value, or again, a pop, a bounce, or what have you. So definitely go ahead and just shut these two off. You can droll this deck pretty well. D-Shifter does nothing against this deck, so definitely take that out if you're playing like Cash. It just doesn't do a whole lot. We're actually seeing a lot of Cash players choose to not play Shifter, which is really interesting because if you run into more Cash mirrors or if you play against Vanquish Soul, the card just really doesn't do anything. It's mostly found in the side deck now, so I'm not saying that you won't get D-Shifter game 1 against Cash or anything, but like it's a lot less likely at the moment because a lot of the players who are aiming for top tables are just realizing that at top tables, D-Shifter in the main deck just really won't do anything, so we're seeing a lot less of it in game 1. Moving forward here though, we have Live Twin Runick Spright. I really want to cover this because this is probably the most prevalent Runick variant that you're going to play against. We'll cover the other ones later on. You can Drill and Shifter this deck very well. Both those cards really do hurt this build. Imperm or Valor on Hugin's always just going to be really impactful. You want to be able to shut off the Fountain Search. Making your opponent start with a lot less resources by having them pitch a card with Hugin and then hitting them with an Imperm or Valor is always going to be really impactful. The one that you might think is a little weird here is Phantasme. This is a card that's actually been seeing a little bit of play, and I think this card's really bonkers right now. It's very good. If you play against like Live Twin Runick Spright and they end with like their IP and then both their links, then you're able to draw quite a lot. Even if it's just IP and like one of the links is still a really solid draw 3, put 2 back, so you can kind of fix your hand. It's also just very good into Flashing Fire and into Curses. And there's actually a lot of different targeting effects in the format right now, so even if you're playing like Kashtira, you could play Phantasme too, especially if you're just like going first and you're like normal it, right? After you like Special Unicorn. It's really cool that you can do things like that. But Ash and Bell on Fountain, always going to be the number one thing that you want to do. You can also Bell the effect of the Link 2s to revive, which is equally impactful. This is going to be something that you do play against quite a bit, so definitely be wary of this matchup. But these are things that I think are going to help out a lot when you're playing against this deck. You should be still on Droll. I know that it fell out for a little while, but we're seeing it back in main decks, and we're also seeing it in almost everyone's sideboard. So definitely make sure that you have Droll handy at your next tournament, because it'll come in handy. Next up here, we have Branded. Now, Branded is still going to be the same deck, essentially, but actually quite a few people are cutting Gimmick Puppet, which is wild to me. I'm still playing that card 100%. That card says you win the game. But we are seeing quite a few people just kind of get rid of Puppet or try out different builds. I'm seeing a little bit of patchwork again. It's definitely interesting. We're definitely seeing like Ad Libitum back in the main deck as well. So it's really going to be a 50-50 in what kind of build you verse. But just know that there is some variance now. But overall, D-Shifter is still going to hurt this deck pretty bad. You really want your graveyard resources. Ogre on Cartasia or Albaz is going to be your best spot to Ogre. I really don't want to include Ogre too much because it's not really that impactful right now. But if there are pretty impactful situations for it, I'll include it. And that's going to be Cartasia and Albaz. Both of these are really solid hits. If your opponent doesn't have another Cartasia, then they're not summoning Granganol. And if they don't have another Spellcaster, they're not even summoning Sanctifier. So definitely a lot of really cool applications as far as Ogring on Cartasia Artesia. Then of course on Albaz, it just means that your monster's not going to get super polyed. Belling Sanctifier is still going to be your best way to go ahead and stop the Gimmick Puppet lock, or at least giving back resources to your opponent that they just don't need. Then of course just using Bishals or Crow onto the Gimmick Puppet lock, or whatever they're trying to go for in the graveyard, whether it be a branded and red target, what have you. Gimmick Puppet is still going to be the #1 card that I'm afraid of when I'm versing branded, so definitely go ahead and look out for this card. Banish it when you can, because again, they don't have branded expulsion anymore. They can't just bring it back from the banish pile. Ash on branded fusion, and then of course Valor Imperm on a Luber. These have always been pretty standard. I really wanted to cover this one more time and just really let everyone know that there is going to be some variance when you are versing this deck now, just because there is a couple different options for the main deck at the moment. We also see some people on Thrust and Fusion Duplication, other people are not, so you really got to make sure that you're watching like what your opponent's doing throughout a duel. Even if you're going to scoop early because you don't think that you can win that game, I think that it might be really impactful to just hang on for another like 2 minutes to see what kind of build that they're on, so you can side better moving forward. Up next here we have Labrynth. Now this matchup can be pretty scary, especially if you're playing a spell deck because Erad, but the best way to be able to like prevent Erad is just going to be ashing Welcome or Big Welcome, or belling Big Welcome, because it just helps you not be able to have your opponent get those big bodies on the board that are able to be tributed off for Erad. You can Valor or Imperm the Ariana. If they have a Lovely, you can go ahead and hit that too, but if your opponent's just starting off their turn, I'm probably just going to hit the Ariana when it hits the board. But overall, these are probably just the better hits. Big Welcome and Welcome are just the overall best cards in the deck to get out their big monsters and start off all their plays. So you really want to make sure that you're siding 3 Bell, you're maining 3 Ash. 3 Ash should just be mandatory in this format, especially with Branded around. I think that Ash will always be mandatory as long as Branded's in the format. But the second that Branded rotates out, maybe we start seeing other formats like before when we were playing like Bell and Meister in the main deck for like other reasons, right? Or just other hand traps, even though Ash is like generically the best one. But like Bell has to be there right now. Not even to just stop the Big Welcome, but it's really good against Branded. It's really solid against Striker to Bell Kagari, especially if your opponent has the linkage OTK and they go Kagari at back the linkage, so you can go ahead and bell the effective Kagari so you don't die. I actually did that recently and that was really solid because I won the next turn. You can Valor or Imperm Kagari, or you can Ash Engage. So a lot of different ways that hand traps can really help you in your gameplay. Some formats, some hand traps are just less impactful than others, which seems pretty crazy because cards like Ash at some point was actually just completely rotated out of our format. So maybe we'll see that again soon, but we'll have to wait and see how the format shapes up and where the next ban list lies. But as for now, Labrynth and Sky Striker, you'll see them in tournaments, so just make sure that you are prepared to stop them with the hand traps that you have. The next thing is going to be Dragon. Now, Dragon's pretty crazy. I think this is going to be one of the most heavily represented decks at Nationals. You really have to know how to play against this deck. If you don't, I really recommend playing against it quite a bit just to make sure that you're not going to be blindsided when you play against this deck. You really want to be able to bell the Magna mods that come out of the deck, just because, of course, this is one that can search any Dragon. They can search Levianeer for follow-up, which is just the best follow-up that you can have, or any other Dragon extender that they need, which is really important. And then, of course, it's just Magnamut. So if you're playing a deck where your monster's getting Bishaled really does matter, then you really want to make sure that you have Bell for this situation. You still really want to Ash Chaos Space if your opponent opens with it, just because of the fact that it gets them so far in their combo. There are a lot of players I'm seeing right now still playing 1 Gamma, 1 Driver, because it's still super impactful, and there's a lot of cards that you want to activate before you commit a monster to the board. You could go ahead and Ash Ravine as well if your opponent doesn't open with Chaos Space. This is still a really impactful hit here. Imperm or Valor on the Bishal Rebellion when they summon it to the board, just because you really don't want your opponent getting to Beast or Regained. Regained is a super crazy grind card, and that's something that you want to make sure that you shut off. You also could shut off the Safer when they normal summon that card, another really solid target because this card leads to a lot of free advantage. And then, of course, if your deck does not have an out for Borland, you might want to hold the Imperm for Borland, but if you have a huge board, definitely make sure that you hold an Imperm to set, because your opponent's going to turbo out to Borland, because this card can attack over everything that you control. So you really want to make sure that you have something to negate this, because it can be affected by spells and traps. So up next we have Tearlament. Now this deck has been getting a huge resurgence lately, and it's a lot of fun to play. The deck did shift a little bit in terms of what it's trying to go for, so the Denier Mally package is a mainstay in the deck at the moment. It's very good because you can go like a Tier Name plus Mally into the Dangerous, which is a level 6. then you can go dangerous, pitch a card, send Mally again, or if you have like a banished Mally or what have you, you can go ahead and just dump like Denier, which is really cool too, because then you can summon Denier, put back Mally, and just do a lot of really nice plays. But overall, you really want to make sure that you're belling or even using Crow onto Denier, just because this is a really easy rank 6 to make cards like Beatrice, so this is a really impactful engine for the deck right now. Belling the shufflebacks is also going to be very impactful, especially if you're playing a deck like Striker and you really need spell count, or if you need your cards to stay in the graveyard. Imperm or Veiler on the Tier Cache or the Purrely, you just really don't want your opponent to be able to gamble as much as possible, because the second they start milling cards, if they are able to hit a card like Kelbeck or Agido, of course they're just one-ofs, but if they do, then it's going to be a really crazy game state to be in. Also, ashing Shiren is probably one of your most important hits that you can do in this deck. You can ash like Kelbeck or Agido, especially if they open ways to those, or if they randomly mill one of them, then of course just ash that. But if your opponent goes activate Shiren in their hand, you are 100% just ashing this every time. And then last but not least, you probably just want to crow the names just because there's only one of each name. So the second that one gets crowed, if they're not on crowing the main deck to mill, then they're going to be in a really bad position. So definitely make sure that you're going to go ahead and crow out the names just so they can't keep fusing out of their graveyard. So talking about Runick for higher Spright, this is a deck that has been popping up everywhere. Now, what if I told you this deck lost as hard to Ash as Branded does? Now, maybe not as hard, but this deck does lose bad to Ash Blossom, and it's because the same thing happened to Natura Runick. If they could not get to their engine, it just turned into pure Runick, and the deck wasn't very good. Now, if you Ash Rookie, this card's a 1-of, sometimes a 2-of, but usually a 1-of. You essentially tribute a monster you control and special summon a for hire from your deck that is one level higher or lower. So typically you're tributing Hugin and summoning Beat. If they can't get to their engine, it's over. Because typically if you stop Rex, then your opponent can't really play the game. It just turns into a Runick deck. You never really want to Imperm or Veiler on the Rex. You can, but at that point, you're going to be risking your opponent just hard opening Rookie. So I'd rather see you just go ahead and Ash the Rookie. But if you only have Veiler Imperm, I'm just going to put my opponent on Better Have It and just Imperm or Veiler the Rex, because at that point, they're not going to put up a board. And you can also Veiler Imperm on Hugin, of course, just to shut off the fountain access. But if you shut off Rex, this deck is super fragile, so definitely don't be afraid of this deck when you see it, because Droll, Ash, Imperm, Veiler, you can bell the effect of Rex in the graveyard too on your turn, and that's really impactful because the only way that Fulgo is able to get all the draws is if you get a destruction. So either you're going to destroy something with like Flashing Fire in your hand, or you're reliant on Rex summoning something back from your graveyard. So Dampa, that you summon off the Fulgo, can get a pop, and that would enable the Fulgo to be able to draw. So if you like crow the Rex out of your opponent's graveyard preemptively, or if you bell Rex effect in the graveyard, then your opponent can't even get to the pop unless they hard open Flashing Fire. So there's a lot of different ways to cut off your opponent from so many resources in this deck. Next up here, we have Rikka Sunavalon. This is a deck that I'll always cover just to make sure that everyone really understands how to beat this matchup, because I feel like a lot of people still don't know how to play against this deck, which is crazy because the deck does very well. Ogre on Rikka Concon. This card is really crazy. You really want to make sure that you are shutting this off every single time. This card gets them to Sheet, to Glamour. It allows them to tribute off your monsters. Just really make sure that you have the ability to shut this card off. Veiler or Imperm on Petal. This is going to be really important as a normal summon. You really want to cut this off. Or you can hold it for the Jasmine if they start off with Lokai, but otherwise you're just going to go ahead and hit the Petal every time. Ash on Sowing is going to be very impactful. I really never like hitting the Dryas, because if I have Ash anyways, I'm just going to Ash the Sowing, because if they already open Sowing, then if you Imperm the Dryas, it just doesn't do anything. Then you can crow the Princess out of the graveyard. Moving on to Kashtira. This deck has been very annoying to play against, but when it comes to Unicorn, you really want to make sure that you're hitting this with Veiler or Imperm. These cards are really impactful against the deck. It's become a lot less consistent than it used to be, so that's something where you really want to capitalize on cards like Veiler Imperm to shut off this card's effect. Ashing the Theosis is still going to be your best bet. You can Ash Prosperity too, but if you have a card in your extra deck that you really do need, it's kind of scary to go ahead and Ash this when the Unicorn's live. Using this on Theosis usually means that your opponent can get to other very valuable resources, so it's still probably correct to go ahead and Ash the Theosis instead. And then Ogre on Birth or Bell on Birth if your opponent is just trying to go for a lot of free value. This is another thing too, where if your opponent's trying to banish cards out of your graveyard, you can go ahead and Bell that as well. Another very impactful scenario, so just keep that in mind whenever you're playing against this, especially if you're playing like Striker. Having a card like Bell around is going to be very impactful, because we all know how crazy Birth is as a card. I really wish this card would have gotten hit, so hopefully moving forward it does. This card does way too much, and I'm not a fan of it. Mikanko. This is a deck that I've been getting a lot of questions about. How do we stop this deck? Now, let me tell you, there's quite a few ways to make sure this deck just doesn't do anything. Now, you want to make sure that you bell this spell over here, the Mikanko Dance. This is a card that allows them to go ahead and reborn. You can also crow this card out of the graveyard preemptively, which is also a very good hit, just so this isn't an infinite resource loop. Now, when your opponent summons Jewel, which is the wind monster, if they control an equipped card, you can't target any Mikanko card with card effects, and that can be really insane to deal with. So that's something that you really want to make sure that you have some kind of answer for. No, I don't think this deck's very real or something that you will play against a lot, maybe even at all, but if you do, I want to make sure that you are prepared to play against this. The other thing too is that you really want to Ash the Arabesque. That's this card right here. This card is pretty crazy. It allows them to bounce a monster that you control and then summon one from their deck, which is usually this one right here, the Sword Mikanko. When you are bouncing and summoning from the deck, Arabesque will then attach to the monster that they summon. So when a card gets attached to the Sword Mikanko, they're able to go ahead and search for another equip spell, Veiler or Imperm this card, just to make sure that they can't get further into their combo. The other thing too is that if any of the Mikankos attack you, you take the battle damage that they would have taken. So if you have a huge monster on board and there's something like 3 of these, you probably just lose unless you have an answer to it. Now, I've heard before that you should just Ash the Ritual, but I don't think that's correct. I think that you just Ash the Arabesque because that card is just the card that they're going to be searching anyway. If it's like a later game state, then for sure go ahead and Ash like the Ritual. But if it's the first thing that they're searching, I'm definitely just Ashing the Arabesque because it's better than them just hard opening it and then you're just like, wow, they already had it anyway, you know? Or just Imperm the Nini. This is the card that allows them to go ahead and just steal one of your monsters for free. So it's like Rondo. They have 2 ways to go ahead and just steal your cards, which can be very annoying. So just make sure that you have something in your deck that's like non-targeting if they have Jewel live. Then really make sure that you're getting rid of this card too, just because you don't want them to be able to keep summoning more cards to their board and like reattaching things, and it can get pretty annoying to deal with. So keep that in the back of your mind if you do end up playing against this deck. The last one here is going to be Purrely. Now, this deck has been really popular lately and something that you really want to make sure that you're prepared for. Imperm on the Happiness, if you have it already and they're going for like the OTK and you have this set, that's something that you might want to think about just because this card can be really impactful to go for. And it's pretty easy to get to as well because, of course, Happy Memories at 3. This is a card that really can have your opponent going for a game very quickly. So if you do have a negation for this, I'd definitely make sure that you hold something for it, especially if your opponent's going second, because this is the line that they're going to go for is the Happy OTK. Imperm Veiler and Purrely is still going to be the best spot that you can go for because, of course, you want your opponent to get into like My Friend and even more resources and being able to just like attach something from grave. Ashing the My Friend Purrely is still just correct. And then using DD Crow and whatever Lily targets is also going to be really impactful so they can't get to that free Exceed. Of course, the Happy OTK is going to be the #1 line, like the game plan now. But if they do get Delicious in rotation, you do need an answer for Nor, so keep that in mind because this deck is still pretty popular going into future tournaments. That you might want to make sure that you have an answer for our towers. I do hope that you enjoyed today's video as we covered quite a few different decks on here that maybe you haven't even thought about yet, and hopefully that does come up for you later on in different tournaments. If you haven't checked my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or my Metafy page, definitely go ahead and check it all out down in the description below. Hope everyone has a wonderful night, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you all so much.